hour begins to strike. 12 o'clock midnight, and a new day begins. It's Tuesday, June the 6th, 1944. "12:40 a.m. Eastern Wartime, New York. Most of the city is asleep now, but the nightclubs are still jammed with after-theater parties, and late radio listeners sitting in their homes are enjoying the accordion, organ, and guitar music of the Three Sons, broadcast over station WEAF. It's 12:41.
We interrupt our program to bring you a special broadcast. The German news agency Transocean said today in a broadcast that the Allied invasion had begun. I repeat, the German news agency Transocean said today in a broadcast that the Allied invasion had begun. There was no Allied confirmation.
A voice from the NBC newsroom, breathless with excitement. There was no Allied confirmation. But from this moment, the network is on a flash basis. 12:43.
The Associated Press recorded the broadcast which said the invasion had begun from the west and that the French port of Le Havre was being shelled. German naval forces off the coast are engaged in a battle with enemy landing craft, the broadcast said. The German news agency said the Allied invasion operations began with the landing of airborne troops in the area of the mouth of the Seine River. I repeat, however, that there is no Allied confirmation of this claim.
No confirmation whatsoever. But at 2:30 a.m., NBC's emergency four-chime alert was rung, calling every newsman and commentator to his microphone on the double, calling engineers and key operating personnel instantly to their stations. And at 2:59, with 1 minute to go before the 3 o'clock sign-off,
the National Broadcasting Company will continue its network service throughout the remainder of the night in view of the important but so far unconfirmed reports from overseas.
Again, this time at 3:15, the four chimes sound. For the space of a heartbeat, there's silence. A second later, over the vast listening network, comes the throb of the victory signal. The victory signal. And then...
This is Robert St. John in the NBC newsroom in New York. Ladies and gentlemen, we may be approaching a fateful hour, and now we have just been informed that we can expect in a very few seconds, a very important broadcast from the British capital. And so now we take you to London.
This is Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. The text of communique number 1 will be released to the press and radio of the United Nations in 10 seconds. Repeat, 10 seconds from now. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. This ends the reading of communique number 1 from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force.
With the reading of communique number 1, the sluice gates were opened, and the electric air was flooded with sound. The secret was a secret no longer. Bold, ringing words announced it to the world. From John Vandercook in London.
The
feints and diversions promised by Winston Churchill and hinted at by the military experts have now been relegated to the limbo of dead words. 250,000 people will say today, this is really it. This is the Queen's move, straight across the board.
And a moment later, we heard broadcast by his spokesman at Supreme Headquarters, Supreme Commander Eisenhower's order of the day.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
As Eisenhower finished speaking, the chiefs of the exiled governments of occupied Europe began.
Landsmenn, som delvis stor forsigelseskamp, som har taget sigte på frigøring.
His Majesty King Haakon VII speaking to the people of Norway. From now on, he's saying, redouble your efforts to confuse and harass the enemy, but do not yet expose yourself or others. This does not apply to organized resistance groups. The underground has already been given its special orders and will receive further orders.
Nu har ført os et godt stykke længere frem på vejen mod sejren og friheden.
His Excellency Peter Gebrandi, Prime Minister of the Netherlands, spoke, and his instructions were much the same. Hubert Pierrot, Prime Minister of Belgium, spoke. And then at last, the leader of the Free French, General Charles de Gaulle. These were his concluding words.
La bataille de France a commencé. Il n'y a plus dans la nation.
The Battle of France has begun. In the French nation, there is one will, one hope. Behind the clouds laden with our blood and tears, we see again the sunrise of our national greatness.
De notre sang et de nos larmes, voici que reparaît le soleil de notre grandeur.
Since the reading of Communique Number 1, there had been constant radio communication between Studio 4K in the NBC Newsroom, New York, and NBC headquarters in London. There and here, newsmen were standing by to broadcast the first eyewitness account of the first radio correspondent to return to England from actual invasion operations. Wright Bryan, accredited correspondent from NBC's Atlanta affiliate WSB, was the man. At 4:18 from London,
Wolf. 10 seconds. Stand by. 8 seconds. 5 seconds. Stand by. 3, 2.
This is Wright Bryan speaking from London. In the navigator's dome in the flight deck of a C-47, I rode across the English Channel with the first group of planes from Troop Carrier Command to take our fighting men into Europe. As our strong ship Snooty crossed above the breakers into the air of France, we emerged into clear moonlight. Now the paratroopers were on their feet, each adjusting his packs and snapping his ripcord over the static line. "You all set?" asked the colonel. "Get this thing hooked for me," he said, as he took his own place closest to the door. The jump lights, a small bank of signal lamps, were gleaming beside the door. They blinked as the pilot threw his switch, and before I could look up, they began jumping. The Battle of Europe had begun, and our squadron had delivered the first Allied foot soldiers to their scene of action.
Wright Bryan was the first. But during the minutes and hours which followed, we were to hear eyewitness accounts of action on D-Day from many other NBC observers and correspondents. Stanley Richardson, Frank McCall, John McVane, Ed Harker, Merrill Muller, David Anderson, Bill Chaplin, George Wheeler, John Vandercook, men of proven courage and wide experience. On that day of June 6, 1944, each stood at some post where history was being made. Several had the chance to talk with the invasion troops just prior to their embarkation. With men like those you hear now, attending church services in the field, singing praise everlasting to God as the gathering planes roar overhead. Then it began. Ed Hocker, flying with bombers of the American 9th Air Force, reported the opening phases of battle as seen from the air.
The name of the plane that took me to see the opening of this great invasion is Hoots Zooch Shooter. We took off before dawn, and then as the dawn of a new day spread out over occupied Europe, the marauders pointed their noses toward the east, headed for their target on the French coast. Below, as my eyes got used to the light, I counted upwards of 60 invasion boats. There were more later, hundreds. Above, the skies were filled with an infinity of planes of all descriptions. Beyond, closer to the French coast, Allied ships of war were blasting the targets along the invasion beaches. That was the picture as France loomed through the sunbeams, haze, and clouds.
And while Ed Hocker reported action in the skies, Stanley Richardson covered action at sea.
My ringside seat was the heaving deck of a United States Naval Patrol torpedo boat, on which I traveled across the channel with the first contingent of a naval task force. We left our patrol torpedo boat based in daylight to accompany the slow-moving light advance guard of ships, which had to pave the way for the actual landing. Long lines of ships of every description were discernible on the skyline. Huge transports, tank landing ships, smaller troop landing craft, tankers and supply vessels of every kind, plodded doggedly along under lowering skies and laboring over heavy seas. Then the fast and heavy combat ships moved up into position. All aligned themselves in the bombardment area to loose a hail of high explosives to protect the troops moving into the beaches on their landing craft. It was within only a few minutes of H-hour of the long-awaited D-Day.
And as Ed Hocker and Stanley Richardson were each viewing one segment of the vast operation, Merrill Muller, reporting from the Advance Allied Command Post in England, gave a broader picture, a picture of the whole.
The whole thing started moving when one man pressed a theoretical button some hours ago. That man was the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who thinks of himself modestly as a Kansas foreman. Everything that could humanly be done had been done up to the point when General Ike pushed the button. The campaign thus passed to the direction of God and the hands of the common soldier. As H-hour D-Day approaches, there is nothing more tactically useless than a supreme commander, except as an inspiration. General Ike is certainly dead. One British battalion cheered him as they clanked aboard their fast landing barge. He waved a friendly hello, and that broad grin lit up his face, a face that showed nothing but confidence in his men, a face in which fatigue is miraculously erased whenever it mirrors the Allied esprit de corps and the fighting spirit of the little men with rifle and bayonet. He came back from the fort full of a sense of victory. No finer force ever went into battle with a better spirit or with greater courage than this one that General Eisenhower had.
NBC observers in Europe were not alone in their efforts to bring the people of America a full and accurate report of the invasion news. Scores of other NBC newsmen here at home stood double duty as well. By wire and wireless, press service ticker, and radio telephone, bulletins had been streaming to NBC newsrooms throughout the country. And quickly as they arrived, they were flashed by air to the ever-swelling radio audience. Till at 9:30 a.m., Robert St. John at broadcasting headquarters in New York reported,
For 6 hours, we have been going on here without interruption. Some of us have made 20 and 30 broadcasts to you already. We're going to continue to give you that coverage without any interruption, without any commercial announcements, without anything but perhaps a little music later in the day occasionally, but nothing but news.
Besides bulletins, news summaries were broadcast at regular and frequent intervals.
Good morning, everybody. Let me summarize for you some of the various broadcasts that many of you may have been listening to for the last 3 hours.
Yes, among the foremost who covered the news that day was the Dean of America's Commentators, H.V. Kaltenborn.
Taking everything into account, it is evident to us here in the NBC newsroom that the first phase of the invasion has been carried through successfully. It is in large force. We have landed at several important points. We are going forward with every indication of continued success.
And in addition to broadcasting bulletins and summaries, we helped you reconstruct the background of the news. Richard Harkness speaking from the NBC newsroom in Washington.
Good morning. Well, when we think of this attack on Hitler's fortress Europe today, we think of it as being purely military. But the fact is that behind this invasion news is a long period of diplomatic maneuvering, a long period of diplomatic pulling and tugging. Well, these diplomatic operations date back almost to the day of Pearl Harbor.
Background news of a different character came from NBC commentators who were veterans of former invasions. Louis Lochner in Hollywood and Alex Dreyer from Chicago reminded us of the days when they witnessed the Germans attacking. And Elmer Peterson in New York observed,
I find myself thinking now of a day in Berlin in 1940. In a German motion picture theater, I watched a newsreel showing the Nazi version of their triumph at Dunkirk. Strangely enough, there was only a smattering of applause, and the reason was apparent. In fact, I heard one German say, yes, it's all very fine, but we had marvelous victories up to the last day of the First War also.
and at 4:39 p.m., we brought you a report of statements just made by the best-informed commentator of all, the President of the United States.
This is Morgan Beatty in the White House in Washington. A few moments ago, the President held his first post-invasion press radio conference. Mr. Roosevelt said he felt the invasion was up to schedule, and, as Prime Minister Churchill would say, that is a mouthful. And here's a very important point he made just before the closing. He said, the thing we should be warned against at this moment is overconfidence. It's dangerous to the war effort. He said the war isn't over by any means, and this operation itself isn't over by any means.
Thus was the news being covered in America and for America by NBC staff correspondents from coast to coast. As Robert St. John had promised earlier in the day,
bulletin by bulletin, report by report, the big story is being built up. We have been putting these bulletins onto the air just as fast as they've come in, and we will continue to do so.
as the day raced on, the broad outlines of the big story emerged with increasing clarity. Till at 6:45, 18 hours almost to the minute after the first invasion flash, this was the picture, as drawn in swift, skillful strokes by Lowell Thomas.
Good evening, everybody. Tonight's communique just in from invasion headquarters summarizes the news of all the successful landings. Allied forces, it says, have succeeded in their initial landings in France, and fighting continues.
the communique goes on with air action, saying that all day Allied planes continued their bombing in what the dispatch calls very great strength. Another bulletin states that a German counterattack is in the making. It says the first German counterattack is likely to materialize within the next 48 hours. And another bulletin just in emphasizes the element of surprise, saying that the Nazis were caught off their guard in an effective surprise by the Allied forces. Well, the news pictures Allied troops battling in the streets of the Norman city of Caen. That place is 9.5 miles inland, which represents a drive of that far from the beachheads established early this morning. The Germans tell us that the landing forces are broadening and strengthening their positions and getting incessant reinforcements. New masses of troops, new tons of armament pouring ashore. Caen is at the base of the Norman Peninsula, which thrusts northward into the English Channel, and the drive to the town makes it look as if the strategy were to cut across the base of that peninsula and force a Nazi withdrawal from the whole area. The possession of that peninsula would mean a powerful base from which Allied thrusts could be driven inland, probably in the direction of Paris. To the British troops in the Second Front forces, that town of Caen represents historic memories. That is, if they have time to think about it. For it was there in the river that William the Conqueror in 1066 assembled his fleet with which he invaded Britain, the Norman conquest, and the mortal remains of the conqueror lie interned in the church of Saint Etienne in the city of Caen. The events of today were studded with records, too. The greatest fleet of ships ever to set sail, 4,000 ships and thousands of lesser craft. The greatest army ever to strike at a hostile shore. That vast force of men and machines, tens of thousands of men increasing to hundreds of thousands, millions before it is over. And the greatest air assault ever delivered. Before the day began in the hours of darkness between midnight and dawn, thousands of British planes hurled more than 5,000 tons of bombs on the Nazi fortifications. Then more than 1,000 American heavy bombers took up the assault, and soon the total tonnage of bombs was more than 11,000. A British air officer remarks that the total tonnage of bombs dropped in this one day of invasion was greater than the amount that the Germans hurled on Britain during the entire 6 months of the Great Blitz.
The nation listened, serious, intent, speculative. And far westward beyond the continent, in the sea-locked, war-bound Hawaiian Islands, this news of invasion assumed a special significance, flaring high as a beacon for the future.
This is Robert McCormick in Honolulu. One aspect of the European invasion that interests us out here in the Central Pacific is what our troops will find when they penetrate more deeply into Hitler's Europe. What observers out here particularly want to know is how much damage has been done to Germany's industrial empire by our intensive bombings. Most of us have always taken it for granted that Japan will someday be subjected to the same terrific bombing attack that we've been giving Germany. We've even thought perhaps Japan will take a worse beating from the air than Germany has. Because by the time we can open up on the Jap mainland, we should have even more and even better bombers than we have now. Also, the fighting in Europe is an unprecedented test of large-scale amphibious operations. The 5th Amphibious Corps out here, the spearhead of the war against the Japs, is extraordinarily skillful in amphibious fighting. But they haven't yet tackled a job as big as that we're trying to do in France. The French invasion is much more nearly what we'll someday have to do on the coast of China or on the Jap mainland.
Almighty God, keep thou this day our soldiers as they fight.
Although early in the day, NBC cleared its board of all commercial announcements and regularly scheduled programs, many top-ranking stars went on the air that evening with special D-Day programs. There was Fred Waring and his Pennsylvanians. There were Ginny Simms, Red Skelton, Nora Sterling, Fibber McGee, and Molly. Solemnly and humbly, these stars of radio paid tribute to America's finest, who on that day had opened a show of their own, a new show that topped anything on earth.
Mine own divine command.
7:30 p.m. from Hollywood, we were privileged to present Ronald Coleman reading the poem and prayer for an invading army written for NBC broadcast on D-Day by Edna St. Vincent Millay.
They must not go alone into that burning building which today is all of Europe. Say that you go with them, spirit and heart and mind. Although the body, grown too old to fight a young man's war, or wounded too deeply under the healed and whitened scars of earlier battles, must remain behind. You who have stood behind them through this hour, move strong from behind them now. Let's still the weary bones encase the indefatigable will.
It was at 10:15 p.m. that Bob Hope spoke from a P-38 fighter base near Van Nuys, California. His words were simple and moving.
What's happened during these last few hours, not one of us will ever forget. How could you forget? You sat up all night by the radio and heard the bulletins, the flashes, the voices coming across from England, the commentators, the pilots returning from their greatest of all missions, newsboys yelling in the street, and it seemed that one world was ending and a new world beginning. That history was closing one book and opening a new one. And somehow we knew it had to be a better one. You sat there and dawn began to sneak in and you thought of the hundreds of thousands of kids you'd seen in camps the past 2 or 3 years. The kids who scream and whistle when they hear a gag in a song. And now you could see all of them again in 4,000 ships on the English Channel, tumbling out of thousands of planes over Normandy and the occupied coast. In countless landing barges crashing the Nazi gate and going on through to do the job that's the job of all of us. The sun came up and you sat there looking at that huge black headline, that one great black word with the exclamation point, invasion. The one word that the whole world has waited for, that all of us have worked for. We knew we'd wake up one morning and have to meet it face to face. The word in which America's invested everything these 30 long months. The efforts of millions of Americans building planes and weapons. The shipyards and the men who took the stuff across. Little kids buying war stamps and housewives straining bacon grease. Farmers working around the clock. Millions of young men sweating it out in camps and fighting the battles that paved the way for that headline this morning. Now the investment must pay for this generation and all generations to come. And folks, what a wonderful thing it is that no matter the price, the reward will be greater than the sacrifice. We hope that thought can go along with a prayer tonight, the prayer of a whole nation. God bless those kids across the English Channel.
And as those kids across the English Channel continued to fight their way desperately shoreward and inland from the coast, there came these reverent words from His Imperial Majesty, King George VI.
If from every place of worship, from home and factory, from men and women of all ages, and many races and occupations, our intercessions rise, then, please God, both now and in the future, and not remote, the predictions of an ancient psalm may be fulfilled. And the Lord will give strength unto his people. And the Lord will give to his people the blessing of peace.
We listened to the news hour after long hour. We heard the figures concerning ships and planes and men. We heard the names of beaches and towns and flaming cities. But what was it really like on the fighting ships and the battle-torn shore? We were soon to hear at least a few of the vivid details. Hear them from our radio reporters who were actually in the midst of a fight on D-Day and who observed and recorded the facts of battle even as they were taking place. For instance,
This is George Wheeler speaking from the heavy cruiser, United States ship Augusta. It's 3:30 on the morning of Tuesday, June the 6th. Just exactly 3 hours before H-hour. The order has just been passed to commence firing as soon as we can bear on the target. In just one moment, you are going to know what it sounds like
to hear a ship of war fire with you not more by microphone than 20 feet from that battery. And we have just come into the area where we can bear on the target and where we are also within range of the target. But in this operation, since there are a great many mines in this area, and since by this time, here we go, that was a salvo of 8-inch guns from this heavy cruiser, the Augusta. Another salvo. A third salvo. Ladies and gentlemen of the United States, we are now in business.
Yes, George Wheeler witnessed a part of the battle at sea, and there on the spot made the recording you've just heard. A recording which was broadcast to us in America as soon as Wheeler was again put ashore the following day. Later on D-Day, Tom Trainer made a similar recording, one of action he had seen and experienced with American troops on the beaches of France.
To reach the palisade, I joined a column who were wading across a slough. The water came nearly to their armpits, and they had to hold their rifles and equipment over their heads. The water was rather warm, but the bottom was a slimy mess. When a man got to the far side of the slough, he would always stop in a maddening way, holding the rest of us up. We shouted angrily, but when we got there, each one of us stopped too. The reeds on the far bank were loaded with mines. One man lay at the top of the bank dead. The mines had been marked with bits of paper, and soldiers at the top advised just how to climb so as not to venture into dangerous ground. There were more dead men along the narrow path which led up the palisade. The column had stopped moving, and I began to step past men following a captain. Suddenly a voice said, "Watch yourself, fella, that's a mine." A soldier sprawled on the bank was speaking. He had one foot half blown off. He'd stepped on a mine a short time earlier. Now, while he waited for litter bearers, he was warning other soldiers about other mines in that vicinity. The captain I was following stopped, and so did I. I asked him his name, and he said he was Louis Hilly of Cincinnati. "It looks like they shell around here a bit," I said, pointing to some shallow craters. "No," said Hilly, "those are all mines. That's why we're stuck on this path." We tried to edge a few feet further forward and came to a soldier lying in the path, curled around a mine. He said his name was Private Morton Soratello of the Bronx, and I asked him if it didn't make him nervous to be curled around a mine like that. "No," he said, "I just keep clear of it and pass the word on to those behind." I waited a spell longer, and the line didn't move, so I began to make my way down the path again. It was slow work. While I was going down the slope, the Germans began shelling our area. It was hard not to throw myself on the ground willy-nilly, but the thought of those mines kept me from it. The shells were still landing at some distance on the flat. I took a last look at the greatest armada in history before going on the flat. It was too immense to describe.
And as the greatest armada went on discharging its cargoes of men and steel, the greatest invasion surged over the rims of the beaches and palisades onto the fields of Normandy, and it could not be stopped. H.V. Kaltenborn spoke the unshaken belief of the men over there and of us back here when he said on that day of June the 6th, 1944,
"Yes, there may be setbacks, there may be delays, but the story of these first hours of invasion tells us what we know in our hearts, that we are sure of victory and that it may come sooner than many of us had supposed."
Our reaction to news of the invasion was quiet and dignified. Just after noonday on June the 6th, radio newsmen reported from cities throughout the land gave you a true picture of the form it took.
This is Edward Wallace in Cleveland. Here in the nation's fifth largest city, the people met the news of invasion with a spirit of quiet determination. Like the rest of the nation, most Clevelanders were asleep when the first word came, but in Cleveland's war plants, the news reached the war workers at the moment it was first announced. Radio loudspeakers brought the first bulletins to them. Work halted briefly. Only a few cheered, but most of them just stood quietly by their lates, offering a short prayer for the safety and victory of their loved ones.
Local reaction in Southern California was what you'd expect of any American community. No hysterical rejoicing, pretty calm and quiet on the whole. No apathy, certainly not that. But a dignified and solemn acceptance of news awaited a long time. The impulse is definitely toward prayer.
This is Ivan Schooley in Denver. The news of the Allied invasion of Western Europe was taken calmly and quietly in Denver and other sections of the Rocky Mountain region, although sirens were blown in many cities as soon as the Allied command officially confirmed the landings. The siren served as signal to many churches throughout the area to open church doors for prayers for the success of the Allied operations.
This is Alex Dreyer speaking. Chicago's usually noisy loop was calm today. There were no excited groups on street corners, no newsboys shouting the advent of D-Day. Hotel lobbies were strangely silent, and everywhere Chicagoans received the momentous news soberly and with a prayer on their lips.
Yes, June 6th, 1944 was a day for prayer. The churches of the land opened wide their doors, and congregations of every religion and creed entered to pray. Special prayers were offered over the air as well by Archbishop Spellman, Bishop Manning, Dr. Peel, Rabbi Poole, and many other leading clergymen throughout the country. And that evening, the people of the United States prayed devoutly with their president.
Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. Lead them straight and true. Give strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts, steadfastness in their faith. Some will never return. Embrace these, Father, and receive them, thy heroic servants, into thy kingdom. With thy blessing, we shall prevail over the unholy forces of our enemy. Help us to conquer the apostles of greed and racial arrogancy. Lead us to the saving of our country, and with our sister nations into a world unity that will spell a sure peace, a peace invulnerable to the schemings of unworthy men, and a peace that will let all men live in freedom, reaping the just reward of their honest toil. Thy will be done, Almighty God. Amen.